Good evening and welcome to the City of Topeka Planning Commission meeting. We are a commission appointed by the mayor and city council to plan for the orderly growth and development of the community, to hold public hearings, and to make recommendations to the city council on planning items. Please note that the city council rules state that public hearings for planning cases shall be conducted solely by the planning commission. No additional public hearings will be conducted by the city council. Tonight's cases are tentatively scheduled to be heard by the city council next month. Agendas can be found at topeka.org. For cases that require public hearings, the procedure will be as follows. First, the planning department staff will summarize the case. Next, we will hear from the applicant or the representative. Then we will receive public testimony. Public comments should be addressed solely to the chair and are limited to 4 minutes. Chris, please take roll.
Mr. Armstrong?
Here.
Mr. Freed?
Here.
Mr. Hogg?
Here.
Ms. Jordan?
Here.
Mr. Kennard?
Here.
Ms. Lawson?
Here.
Ms. Messina?
Here.
Ms. Ringler?
Here.
Mr. Warner?
Here.
We have 9 and 4.
Thank you. First item on the agenda is approval of our minutes from our August 20th meeting. If there's any discussion, questions, corrections that need to be addressed?
I have one correction that I'd like to note, or clarification. Under the declaration of conflict of interest section where it states Ms. Lawson stated that she lives in a building, I was wondering if we could add to that that I left the room immediately after making that declaration.
Any other comments, questions? With that change, is there a motion?
I move that we accept the minutes with the correction that Ms. Lawson suggested.
Second?
I'll second.
There's been a motion and a second to approve with the change. Chris?
Okay. Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
Aye.
Mr. Hogg?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan?
Aye.
Mr. Kennard?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson?
Aye.
Ms. Messina?
Aye.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
And Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
All right. In that vein, are there any declarations of conflict of interest or ex parte communications for this meeting? Seeing none, I will proceed then to the public hearing section of our meeting. Looks like we have 2 items on our agenda. The first is a visual code update 1. Who's presenting?
Madam Chair, I'll just real quickly kick it off here. Dan Warner will introduce the first update regarding non-residential design standards, and then Mike Hall will address the number 2 there, the landscaping code enhancements. As you know, we've been at this for about the last year or so. A lot of work has been done behind the scenes. A lot of work has been done in front of you as well, so we appreciate that to get to this point. Tonight is a public hearing, which means you will, after staff presentation, you can take any comments from the public, and creates more of a body of evidence for issues that you should consider tonight. This is up for action. You don't have to take action, but it is up for action at the end of all the testimony and presentations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm going to go over the presentation that I've given a couple other times here. It's changed a little bit, but just for the benefit of those that are in the audience or might be watching along that haven't plugged into the process previously, we're going to kind of go over the process here. So we're talking about non-residential design standards. The first image on the screen is not meant to show you, well, why didn't that storage building get designed like that? Tudor house next to it. That's not the intent of the design standards. The standards are not promoting any particular architectural style. The real issue here is that that particular building in the middle doesn't address the street with architectural details, windows, doors, those kinds of things that make for better design. So that is essentially what the standards are for, to improve these kinds of situations and make them better overall designs. A couple notes on process. So staff has been practicing with the design standards for the last couple years, and projects come in either through building permits or site plans, reviewing those and testing them against the design standards. I want to mention that the standards are primarily based on something that was produced for a unified development code for Topeka back in 2006. That development code was not implemented, but in the last couple of years we've sort of extracted the design standards out of that and began using them. They have changed quite a bit since we've gone through the process. The Planning Commission kicked off this process on November 17th. You heard from Mark White, who has been retained to assist us with this effort. And he talked primarily about why design review, why do that. After that meeting, staff put together an online visual assessment survey. We released that in January of 2018. It was out for a month. I have a couple slides. I'll talk about that. We convened a technical review committee in December of 2017. That was a group of local architects, and Matt Werner was representative of the Planning Commission on that committee. The task of that committee was to provide input on the standards, which they did. I also want to mention that at their first meeting, we presented the standards in that current form and also showed them some examples of design guidelines, some different types of design standards from different communities, and in particular Lawrence and Kansas City, Kansas. And the committee ultimately recommended that we use the product that you have before we deny it. They're prescriptive design standards, but there's some flexibility built in there, and I'll touch on that as well. Finally, we hosted a development forum on July 18th. We have an email list of a very large number of development professionals that we notified about that meeting, and had a really great turnout at that meeting. Had a lot of people that came and listened to our presentation at that time. So real quick on the visual appeal survey. So people were asked to assess the visual appeal of a building. They were asked to rate 12 images. And it went somewhat like this. The image on the right popped up. They were asked to rate it as very appealing, somewhat very unappealing, somewhat unappealing, neutral, appealing, or very appealing, something to that effect. So the results are presented either by raw numbers on the right or in a graph form, a bar graph form. 1,062 people took the survey, which was pretty amazing. Even more incredible were 480 people provided written comments, and that information is available on the website. You can go read every one of those comments if you'd like. So there's 2 questions at the end of the building design survey that were not rating images, but just 2 direct questions. So the first one was, how important is building design to the visual appeal of a community? Everyone answered that question, and 96% of them said either very important or somewhat important. And then the other question was, what factors are most important to the visual appeal of buildings? They're asked to rate their top 2, and architectural details and landscaping were chosen, landscaping being number 2. This is interesting because landscaping was not prompted in the survey at all prior to that question. We did have images that had, similar buildings that had better landscaping than others. So we were interested to see how those buildings rated, but we did not have any notion of a landscaping until that particular question. And then of those 480 comments, written comments that we got, many of them talked about how landscaping was important to the design of the building or the overall design of the site. So as a result, excuse me, we have elements in our alternate compliance, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that if the overall site design doesn't meet, there are elements for alternate compliance, improving landscaping on the site, for instance, that can help qualify an overall design. And then Mike will talk to you about some specific landscape ordinance changes that we're making. We got very good direction, we feel, out of the survey to improve our landscaping. So what are we talking about? We're talking about non-residential design review. So we're requiring building elevations that detail materials, architectural details, windows and doors. Those are sort of the three major design elements, and four-sided design. We're doing this because currently we don't have citywide design review for commercial projects. If we have a site that has some interest in good design, we try to steer them to the PUD zoning process where we can review design as part of that process, but even then we don't really have specific guidance as to what standards to use to review that project. Within the last year or so, went through a process to convert the D1 or the C5 zoning downtown to D1, and we codified design review downtown. So in addition to, so downtown we have design review in our D1 and also our historic districts. We thought that went well enough that we could try to apply that to other non-residential projects citywide. We have a policy basis in our land use and growth management plan. We're partnering with the sign code. As part of this process, the survey had a sign element as well, and then we're also going through some landscaping updates again that Mike's going to talk about. So overall, this is a visual codes update that we're going through. So most of the projects that we get don't really need design review. They're fine as they come in. No real issues. What we're most concerned about are the ones that really do need some sort of design review to sort of elevate them and get them to be a little better designed. So that's really what the design standards are for. We'll talk about the draft. Next, we're going to talk about applicability, the exemption alternative compliance section of the document, touch on the design review standards, and mention the appeal. So applicability, so the design standards will apply to new construction or alteration whose floor area is plus or minus 50%. So again, any new construction or alteration whose floor area is plus or minus 50%. And then also, any project requiring a building permit that proposes to remodel at least 50% of the front and or street facade. Front and or street facade is underlined here because the standards focus most on fronts and street facades. There are instances where the front is not on the street, so that's why we divide those up. So underlined for emphasis here. The design standards are organized by building type. So there's three building types, A, B, and C. A is the highest design criteria, B is kind of in the middle, and C is the lowest. So building type is based on zoning district. So our A buildings are required in our office and institutional districts, our C1, C2, which are our light commercial, medical services, X3, and downtown, so all the D districts. The B building type is in C3, C4, which is our more heavy commercial districts, U1, which is the university, and X1, mixed use district. And then C is our industrial districts, I1, I2, and X2. So one of the kind of built-in flexible items in the design standards is the exemption. So we've included in the draft the ability for the planning director to exempt the application of design standards if the applicant can show some undue hardship. There's kind of three overall things there that can be used to help make that case: function, size, use of building, lack of visibility from the public right-of-way, and there's, if the design is consistent with the overall context of the area. So this is, a limited application item here. We don't really want to do this very much, but it is available if needed. And then another part of the flexible nature of these design standards is alternate compliance. So if a design is failing one of those three major design ideas, maybe it's lack of windows. They can potentially apply for alternate design by enhancing the site landscaping. There's some options in the list of items under alternative compliance to improve the landscaping on the site. They can alter the signs, add more architectural details, etc. So so essentially, we're not meeting the design 100%. Well, here's some options that'll help you get there by improving. Basically, a lot of that has to do with improving the site. And that, again, kind of comes from our survey. We heard that a lot, that the site really impacts the design. Okay, so once again, key design elements are building materials, architectural details, windows and doors. Can't really see this very well, but just to note that the design standards are organized in a matrix. It's basically 2 pages at the end of the ordinance. We're not going to go over that point by point, but this first page here shows, which you can't really see unless you go to your draft, the list of building materials that are acceptable, for instance. So that's another part of the kind of flexible nature of the design standards. We're not saying you have to pick these 3 building materials. There's a list of them there that you can pick to get to the percentage that you need to qualify. So generally speaking, we'll go over the design standards this way. So for a type A building, that requires 85% of the listed materials for type A building. So 85%, for instance, stone or brick on the street or front side of that building. So a type B building is 60%, and C is a little different. It's not quite, doesn't work quite the same. A type B building requires 3 architectural details on the street or front. An A is 4, and a C is 2. And again, there's a list of details that are in the document. And then type C building is 25% windows and doors on the front facade. The percentages are higher for A is 50% and B is 40. I do want to note that there's also a section of the document that says the planning director can approve materials that aren't listed. So architects, designers can make their case that a material meets the quality materials that we are looking for here, and it's possible that can be approved as part of the design. There's essentially 2 more design standards, not really the major ones, but still important. The first one is non-street or non-front facing walls. This is essentially a blank wall standard. There's architectural details required based on how long that wall is, so kind of breaking up the mass. And then finally, there's screening requirements for roof-mounted mechanical systems, which is definitely a brand new standard. Similar to other appeal processes, if the planning director deems a project's not in conformance, that gets appealed to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So the recommendation is, as Bill mentioned, to have a public hearing on this, and we recommend approval if you're ready to do that to the governing body. Be happy to answer any questions.
The commissioners have any questions for Mr. Warner at this point? Generally, we would ask for the applicant, but I guess the city is the applicant in this case.
Sure are.
So we will open this for a public hearing. If there are any members of the public who would like to come forward and speak to this agenda item, we would gladly like to hear from you. I don't see anyone. We will close the public hearing then. Discussion by the commission.
Well, we've gone through this several times. You guys have, the department's made several changes that we've requested, and I think it does a good job of helping Topeka look better moving forward.
think the flexibility that's built into the plan is very helpful for architects. You can usually work around any design based on what you presented here.
Good.
Mr. Warner, you served on that committee, right?
That's correct.
Do you feel satisfied with?
Yeah, very satisfied. As Commissioner Freed said, we've run through this a number of times, and the committee met 3 or 4 different times over the past year, and feel like we've fine-tuned it to the point where we're satisfied with it, and I think we're ready to move it forward.
Any further discussion points, questions?
The only thing I would note is that a lot of work went into it, and if there's any strong objections to it, they didn't care to come and make them known at the meeting, so I'd be in favor of this.
Any other questions or comments? If not, I would entertain a motion. Mr. Armstrong?
Since you're on the committee, do you want to make the motion?
Sure. I'd like to make a motion for approval of adopting the non-residential design standards.
Second that one.
Commissioner Lawson? We have a motion and a second by Commissioner Lawson. Any further discussion? All right. Chris, we can take roll.
Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
Ms. Messina?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson?
Aye.
Mr. Kennard?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan?
Aye.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
Aye.
Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
Thank you. Second public hearing on the agenda is also visual code update number 2. I'm assuming staff will fill us in.
So Commissioners, this is Visual Code Update Part 2. This is a series of text amendments to existing standards, so this is not quite as ambitious as what Dan just presented. And as Dan said before, you've heard this presentation before. This is kind of maybe enhanced a little bit from the last one. Doesn't mean longer necessarily, but also want to make sure that anyone who's here in attendance has the opportunity to understand what is being proposed. So the purpose of this is to follow up on what we learned from the Visual Appeal Survey. And the survey was very significant in that there was a lot of participation. It was pretty clear what the opinions were about what makes sites and buildings more appealing. Unsolicited advice about landscaping was provided by the participants in that survey, and it was fairly significant and clear how the public feels about landscaping based on the survey. So some slides just giving you some context of this. This is a landscape plan that was approved in 2015. This is the Sonic Drive-In. It was a redeveloped site. This is a landscape project, new building back in 2006. This one, it is fairly attractive with a lot of trees along the street, a lot of landscape along the street. It turns out that this actually exceeded the requirements in place at the time. So another part of this is about screening tow yards, tow lots, and outdoor storage yards for like contractor yards, that type of thing. This is how the tow lots can sometimes cross the threshold and become more like a demolition yard or look like a demolition yard or a junkyard. Contractor yards, usually it's storage of equipment and materials. So right now, there is no screening requirement for tow yards along street rights of way. There is a screening requirement if they are for the property lines that are adjacent to residential zoning or land use, but not just generally along street rights of way. This is just another example of an outdoor storage yard. Looks like more like a contractor shop in their outdoor yard. So first component of this, before I get into this, one thing I do want to explain is just how the landscape ordinance is used, how it's applied. So landscape ordinance is applied when there's a new project, new construction of a building, or a building that's being expanded by 50% or more, or a parking lot that's being expanded by 50% or more. A few other situations might call for a landscape plan being required, but that's generally how that works. The landscape ordinance is based on a point system, so certain elements of the project or the site generate a certain number of points, and those points are satisfied by the provision of plants in the landscape plan. The points are generated by the size of the site, the number of parking spaces, and some other factors. You can get credit for preserving existing trees. You can get some credit for stormwater best management practices. Certain plants generate more points than others because they have a more beneficial impact or a more significant impact. For example, trees generate a lot more points per plant than, say, a shrub or other landscaping. And the large canopy trees generate more points than, say, an understory tree or an ornamental tree. So it's not an extremely prescriptive ordinance. It allows for some creativity. It allows the designer creativity to get to the points in the way that best meets the needs of the project. The ordinance does have a statement in it currently in the performance objectives that plantings shall be emphasized along street frontages, but that's pretty much what it says about it. It doesn't say any more about how much should be emphasized along street frontages, like a number or quantity or anything else. But clearly that's where the most beneficial impact is, and sometimes that's, depending on the project and the land use, that's where there can be some resistance to doing that. Sometimes the owner or developer is concerned about someone being able to see the building or the sign. I mean, usually it's the sign. And sometimes it's just a matter of cost. So this first piece of this, increase the overall quantity of required landscaping for new development. So for all but a few of the districts that are more industrial in nature, or even a couple of the mixed-use districts, the landscaping would be increased by 20% over what is currently required. And if you want to look at the specific text that addresses that, it's on pages 42 and 43 of the draft ordinance. And I do have some examples to show you in just a few minutes. Second piece of this is to establish a minimum standard for landscaping along street frontages. So what this would do is be a little more specific and a little more directive about that objective to emphasize plantings along street frontages by requiring that 50% of the required landscaping be provided along street frontages in the event there's a site with one street frontage, and for each additional street frontage, it increases by 10%. So 2 street frontages, such as a corner lot, 60% of the required landscaping would be along the 2 street frontages. A lot with 3 street frontages, there are some of those out there, it'd be 70%. So the important thing here is it's 70%, it's 50, 60, and 70% of the required landscaping. So it doesn't mean that a developer owner can't put in more landscaping to make sure that they have landscaping along the other sides of the site. The specific text for this ordinance is on pages 41 and 42 of the draft ordinance. It's attached to the packet. So here are just a couple of examples just to give you some idea. This site was developed, I think, in 2006. It's on 29th Street, just east of Fairlawn. And the points required were 123, points provided 125. I think some of the plants actually died. But the overall point is that they met the points, but the landscaping is really pretty scant. There's just nothing special along the frontage. Another example, this is the Hy-Vee convenience store gas station on 29th, west of Wanamaker. Acquired points in this case were 111, points provided 278, which is really hard to see that there because almost all the landscaping is around the building. There are no trees along the frontage. This is another project, a little more recent. They met the required points. Most of the points are concentrated around the building apparently, and there are some shrubs along the front, which is appropriate, and there are some street trees, but that's what, I'm trying to give you a picture of what it looks like for a project that meets the points currently. So this is I think I mentioned this before, this is on Wanamaker. It's between 21st and 29th on Wanamaker on the west side of the road. And this one exceeds the points that were required by probably 60%. I did look at the landscape plan, and actually how they planted it looks a little different than the landscape plan, but it's pretty close. But this is an example of a pretty attractive landscape. Next point is revise the required landscape setback along street rights-of-way. So for lots platted prior to June 11, 2002, which is when the landscape ordinance was adopted originally, increase the landscape setback from 4 feet to 5 feet. Right now, it is 4 feet, although it's a little bit vague about that, but the way we implement it is we require landscape plans to have a 4-foot setback for the parking lot from the front property line. So this would increase that to 5 feet. At the last meeting, we had proposed 6 feet. As we thought some more about this, what we recognized is a lot of times the property line is 1 to 2 feet behind the sidewalk. So with the setback of 5 feet, you're usually going to get 6 feet behind the sidewalk or 7 feet behind the sidewalk, which is really sufficient to meet the minimal goals of providing a place for landscaping to thrive. And this is specifically shown on page 46 of the draft ordinance, if you want to look at that. So another point here is a 20-foot landscape setback is currently required for lots platted on or after June 11, 2002. So here are some images just showing what certain types of setbacks look like. This is the Sonic again, 4-foot setback from the property line, approximately 5 feet from the back of the sidewalk. I think what's important here is there is a place for plants. As you can see there, the trees they're really understory, kind of multi-branch, multi-trunk type of trees, more like bushes than trees, but those do classify as trees, but they are small trees. So this is Herman's. So this landscape setback is 7 feet from the back of sidewalk. I think the property line is somewhere, it's a little more than 2 feet from the back of the sidewalk. So again, that varies quite a bit. There are limitations sometimes to planting right at the edge of the right-of-way as well, because sometimes there are utilities that are in the right-of-way. And the trees can get in the way of the right-of-way. And sometimes also, as you can see with those overhead power lines, that can be an issue as well. So that's another reason to make sure you have enough of a setback to allow those trees to grow and to avoid conflicts with overhead power lines. So this is the project with the ample landscaping, and it has a landscape setback of 18 to 20 feet from the property line, approximately 22 feet back of sidewalk. Okay, so getting back to this 20-foot setback, landscape setback that's required, what was recognized as we look at this, especially in coordination with the building design standards that are being proposed, is that we want to provide some incentive for the owner, the developer, designer, not a requirement necessarily, but an incentive to bring the building up closer to the street and have less emphasis on the parking lot, but more on the building. It's a more attractive design, it's more pedestrian friendly, and it just provides a nicer streetscape. Some people might even say buildings close to the street actually act to calm traffic, just because there's more enclosure around the street space. So what we're proposing here is to allow a reduced building and landscape setback for site plans that meet particular design conditions, including how the off-street parking is sited and the degree to which that fronts on the street. So for specific language for this, you'd want to look at pages 40 and 46 of the draft ordinance. So this is how this would work. This is a vacant site, and this is a site that would normally require a building setback of 25 feet from the front property line. But with the standards being proposed, they could bring the building closer to the street if the parking lot, and that part of the parking lot that fronts along the street, is less than 50% of the frontage of the lot. So as you can see here, the site shows a reduced building setback. This is also based on the premise, or the requirement, rather, that the building complies with the design standards that were just presented to you. So if it's a type A building that's required, it'd need to be a type A design standard. Type B, it'd need to be a type B design standard, and so on. And as you can see in this case, this parking lot fronts on less than 1/2 the frontage. What would also work is if the parking lot was entirely behind the building, of course. But that's how that would work. Screening requirements for tow lots and contractor yards. So what this would do is require that where these tow lots and these contractor yards, outdoor storage yards, front on right-of-way, street right-of-way, they would have to have screening. They would have to have either a solid fence or solid landscaping to the extent that you can't see through it, or a combination of both that would accomplish those things. And this is specifically on pages 3, 12, and 38 of the draft ordinance. So on page 3, that's the land use matrix. And so what that does is it changes a use that's just an allowed use, permitted by right use, and adds the S to that column, which means that it's subject to specific use standards. And then you go to the specific use standards in the ordinance, and those are on 12 and 38. 12 is for tow lots, 38 is for contractor yards. So this is our example of an unsightly storage yard, tow yard. So what the ordinance would require is along the street frontages, they would need to, again, this is a new tow lot, it's not retroactive. We wouldn't go out and say you have to plant these shrubs after you're already there, but a new yard, they would need to provide landscaping, screening landscaping along the street frontage, and or a solid fence, an opaque fence. A lot of the fences you see aren't this attractive, but this is kind of an ideal. These are industrial grade solid fences. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions you have. Yes, sir.
Just on that very last slide, can we go back one? The end of your description is about yards abutting residentially zoned property. Like, is that a house, and how does that, is that part of the facility?
In this particular case, I think I don't know if it's part of the facility. I don't think it is. I think it's a separate house. I don't know if it's occupied. But if someone was putting in a new tow yard today, they would be required to screen along that edge.
Okay.
Are there any other questions for the staff at this point?
I do have one. As in the last one we just voted on, is there in this document that the planning director may override any of these requirements?
So to answer your question, Commissioner, in the landscape ordinance, there's quite a bit of discretion. If something just doesn't work for a site, the planning director may approve an alternative landscape plan. We found that can be the case with industrial uses because the sites can be large in some cases, have large outdoor areas, or just unusual site conditions. So that is a possibility.
And again, all of these, including the screening, are only triggered by 50% remodel or expansion?
I would say that if there was any addition, well, to answer your question, with the landscaping, a landscaping plan is required when there's a 50% increase in an existing building, a new building, or a 50% increase in a parking lot. Another thing that might require it is, let's say that someone's adding onto their parking lot, and it might not be 50%, but where they're adding the parking lot is abutting some residentially zoned property or used property, then we would require a landscape plan to make sure that they have proper screening between those two uses. In the event of the tow lot, I haven't really thought that through very much, but I think if there's any increase that would increase the frontage, any increase would have to comply with this standard.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Comments to staff? At this point, we would open a public hearing. If there's anyone in the audience who would like to address this agenda item, we welcome you to come forward. Okay, seeing no one, I'll close the public hearing. Further discussion by the commission? Any other thoughts?
I do have another question, Madam Chair. So for the parking lot, for the increasing that, will the landscape be redone for the entire property or just the 50% add-on, 50 plus? Does that stay in there?
That is, I think that's a situational thing. If someone is redeveloping a site and it affects their entire site, we'd probably try to bring the entire site up to standard.
Okay.
Again, if it's unreasonable, we can kind of back off of that.
So you have that discretion?
Plan director has that discretion. We try to use that discretion in a consistent, thoughtful way and in a limited way as well.
Sure.
Questions, comments, discussion points?
I guess my only comment is, as with the building standards, those lots that exceeded the landscaping requirements, and I think the visual survey proved that. Those are more appealing, and I think, are going to add to the community, even with just the modest increase that we're talking about in requirements with this. So I think it's a great idea.
And I think, like we were talking about with the last one, there's been a considerable amount of conversation, study, discussion. So at this point, I feel like it's ready to implement. Are there any other thoughts, questions? If not, I would entertain a motion.
Madam Chair, I would move for approval of the visual code update in 2.
And I'll second.
Any further discussion or comment? Yes, we have a motion and a second.
Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
Aye.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan?
Aye.
Mr. Canar?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson?
Aye.
Ms. Messina?
Aye.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
Thank you. That concludes the public hearing portion of our agenda. We do have a communication to the commission. Mr. Ryan?
We do. It's a sad one.
Yeah.
It's a sad but a happy one, probably for Commissioner Hahn. Sad for us. this is Commissioner Hahn's last Planning Commission meeting. He's been with us for 6 years now, 2 successful terms. And I will say that him and I think you and probably Mr. Gale were our first real design professionals on our commission. We kind of turned the corner, started looking at things a little differently and really adding your perspective. And I think that is now become a tradition. We actually want that, and I think when we look for new volunteers and commissioners, we look for that. And I think that's hopefully what we'll have in your replacement. But I think there's no more fitting item to end on than this tonight to really advance, our quality of design and community aesthetic forward and advance that in a way that was probably a long time coming. So with that in mind, I'll read your, it's not a proclamation, but it is a recognition. City of Topeka, on this 17th day of September 2018, in recognition of Dennis Ha for his service to the city as member of the Topeka Planning Commission, Planning Commissioner in November 2012, September to 2018, Mayor Michelle Della Isla. Thank you very much for everything, and I will see if you have any parting thoughts.
I wanted to just thank the community for having the opportunity to serve them as a member of the Planning Commission, and I also want to commend the staff for the fine work you do and all we do together to make Topeka a better place to live. I enjoyed it immensely.
Well, likewise, we appreciate your service. We're sad to see we have term limits, but it's time to go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you very much. I think the rest of us echo those sentiments. With that ends the agenda tonight. And if there are no objections, I will move to adjourn. All right, adjournment.
Thank you for your service, Dennis.